Welcome back to more Warhammer lore. In today's video, we will be delving into the violent and gluttonous Ogre kingdoms, specifically their society, locations, and important history. Of course, all the information found in this video was taken from the latest army books, the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and the Warhammer Fantasy novels. So, without further ado, strap on a gut plate, heft your sky cannon, because it's time to set some light on the Ogre kingdoms. Before we get into anything else, we should establish what exactly an ogre is, and to do so, we will need to tread some old ground. If you've seen my previous video on the old ones of Warhammer, this will be a bit of a refresher. For you that have not, well, I recommend watching it when you are, of course, able. The old ones, the enigmatic supposed alien race that came to the Warhammer world, is completely responsible for the state of the world as it is today. As the Old Ones, as they are known, took interest in this hunk of rock and the life that was and could be, with the guidance of a helping hand. And so the Old Ones, much like a gardener, began to prune the unwanted weeds and plant and take care of the desirables to best fit into their great plan as it was. It was during this time that the dragons were almost purged from this earth, having to take shelter amongst the ruins of what was now Ulthuan, as well as the dragon ogres, which were also almost hunted to extinction, and who knows how many other races or beasts met their end for not fitting into the great plan. To aid in this endeavor, mortal servants were created in what we now know as the Lizardmen. And if you are asking yourself what in the name of Tall's Green Pastures does this have to do with the ogres, we're almost there. You see, in addition to destroying, and in a way purging the world, the Old Ones began to uplift races for reasons possibly unknown. But through their actions, they also disturbed something old and primordial, and the antithesis of the Old Ones was brought screaming into this world as chaos was unleashed upon the Warhammer world, and ultimately doomed all the great plan had worked so hard for. But these enigmatic creatures apparently saw this coming of chaos and began to shape and mold the lesser races to possibly halt its spread. It was then that the elves of Ulthuan were given the gift of sorcery, for which they had an affinity. But this also made them easily swayed by temptation and power of the ruinous gods. The next race uplifted were that of the dwarves, a star-world people devoid and even resistant to magic, but too set in stone in their thinking and opposed to change. And so men were uplifted with the capacity to adapt and respond to the ever-changing tactics of the enemy. But they soon became the most easily swayed by chaos, as their hearts were also easily conquered by the ruinous gods, as they were by righteousness. At this point, the warp gates had already torn asunder, and chaos was butchering its way across the land. And still the Old Ones had not yet given up on the world, but they had run out of time. The fallings of the previous races were apparent to these gods amongst us, and in one last attempt to correct their mistake and create a counter to chaos and its spread, both the ogres and the halflings were created with the specific idea of combating the ruinous powers. However, they were both obviously either not finished or flawed in a way that the Old Ones did not have time to correct, and their plan was lost to time as chaos very nearly wiped out the world as we know it, were it not for the elves and the Great Vortex, and of course the aid of many of the other races. But sadly, the ogres would not play a great part in this war, nor the halflings. Some evidence points to the ogres as being developed as some sort of super soldier, as they are on average about twice the size of an adult man and several times as wide. Of course, the most obvious feature are their great distended guts, which have multiple levels of importance in their society, but from a physical standpoint insulates and protects their vital organs, as apparently they are much further down than a man's. These layers of fat also disguise the thick corded slabs of muscle that all ogres possess, which lends them almost unequaled strength and stamina. lending them surprising speed when needed and the ability to heft extremely heavy loads over great distances. One interesting aspect of their unique physiology is that ogres apparently do not need to wear heavy layers of armor, as their natural hide and musculature is usually enough to stave off grievous wounds, and you can find most ogres not wearing much in the way of clothing, as apparently they suffer little from the effects of climate change, and seem to be able to adapt, much like humans, to a wide array of environments. But it would be impossible to describe an ogre without touching on their eating habits, as they apparently have an unquenchable desire for food and will eat damn near anything. And in fact, similar to a troll, ogres, through the use of particularly strong teeth and an interesting digestive tract, can eat just about anything and stay relatively healthy. It is not uncommon for an ogre to eat his meals raw and still squirming with little fear of getting sick or by the maw regurgitating precious food. They have a rather hardy constitution, as well as an almost natural resistance to the corrupting influence of chaos. Though that is not to say that they cannot fall, because many tribes have. It just takes quite a bit more than the average person, let's say. As far as the ogre psychology is concerned, you will find that ogres are not exactly deep creatures. In fact, many would go so far as to say they are, in fact, complete idiots. And while I wouldn't recommend saying that to their faces, it is not very far from the truth. To be honest, an ogre's range of thought usually only is applied to eating, fighting, and finding a way to eat more. In fact, they are fairly simple creatures when you come to this realization. They are very capable of great acts of destruction and evil, but they are not necessarily an evil force, as they themselves are not capable of registering their acts as either good nor bad. And concepts of morality and loyalty only come into play with the promise of food. Now, I'm not saying that they are incapable of thought, because this is certainly not the case. It would be easier to think of them as simple humans with the potential for acts of abhorrent violence and the drive of a starving animal. They are also very great fans of wealth, though only so far as with wealth comes status, and with status comes more food, and so on and so forth. Meaning that ogres will steal gold and jewels and hoard treasures, but typically with the idea of using said spoils to purchase, bribe, or possibly even bait food into coming to them. However, despite their appetites and rather loose morals, there is one further aspect of ogre psychology I believe warrants an inclusion. This is the concept that might makes right, and the strong are allowed to take and eat the weak, which is the core belief that ogre society revolves around. And you might see some similarities with some of the other races of the Warhammer world, specifically the Greenskins have a similar philosophy, but that is neither here nor there. But before we get too far into the structure and hierarchy of the ogre society, we need to cover their history to understand what has shaped them to this day. Ogres do not record their history in the written word, but one could assume rely on tales and possibly pictures to pass down the deeds of their people and clans. They do speak a rather guttural language known as Grumbarth, or Ogrish to outsiders. And the very beginning of their history starts after the collapse of the Chaos Gates and the war between the forces of Order and that of the Dark Gods that was staved off for a few thousand years. You see, the ogres lived in the Far East, in the steppes neighboring distant Cathay, the grand empire of the Celestial Dragon. Food was plentiful, and the ogres found that their neighbor paid well in both wealth and food for the use of their people as elite shock troops in their armies as well as personal bodyguards. A similar task they perform today in the Empire and beyond. But the prosperity of the ogres would be its downfall, as they were allowed to grow in too great a number. And while at this time they were not nearly as obsessed with gluttonous urges as they are today, they did require a great deal of food. And if you were to observe these said ogres from the distant past, you might see different defining characteristics, perhaps more musculature, perhaps possibly even more of a noble look about them. And those once benevolent neighbors soon became easy meals, as they were seen as small and too weak to oppose the now bursting tribes. What happened next may have been a coincidence, or it has been alluded that the Emperor may have used his conclave of celestial sorcerers to bring down a comet and decimate the ogre homeland. This comet may in fact have been a splinter or piece of the Chaos Moon, Morslip. Now, upon the impact of this rock, 2/3 of the ogres lost their lives this day, which did in fact save Cathay from the spread of the brutes. Because of this incident, the land was left poisoned and decimated, and quickly the remaining ogres were forced to resort to cannibalism to survive, meaning that only the strongest of their race was left standing. Now, I will be covering what we know now as the Great Maw in a separate video, but needless to say, the comet, or whatever it may have been, was heralded as a god of hunger and ruin, sent to punish the ogres for their lack of faith, and thus the Great Maw was born. To this day, it inhabits the very crater that destroyed the ogre's homeland as a literal physical manifestation of their hunger. With this coming of a new religion and the change of the ogres due to their circumstances that had fallen on them, the tribes set out to scatter across the Warhammer world, and their first stop for most were the mountains to seek shelter in caves, which also happened to be inhabited by fierce beasts and other insidious threats. The ogres, being a people of hunger and strife, conquered these places and kept moving, till eventually they found places very, very high in the mountains, so high they were above the clouds, or great herds of what we know now of as mammoths and other cave beasts were being kept like cattle for an even older and ancient race known as the Sky Titans. Now, the Sky Titans are a fascinating race that I may cover by themselves one day, but they are believed to be the progenitors to the modern giants of the Warhammer world. Though they were a far cry from the misshapen, dim creatures we know of today, and were known to live in massive fortresses and utilize cannons the size of ships to defend themselves. They were, however, no match for the bloodthirsty tribes and the hundreds upon hundreds of ogres that had survived the birthing of the Great Maw. And one by one, the ogres adapted to fighting in groups, actually forming, for the first time, the ogre tribes that we know of today. And the tribes proceeded to take down the isolated targets one by one and strip all the meat from their bones and that of their flocks, until eventually there were no titans left. It would seem that they had literally eaten them into extinction. Though rumor has it that some fled away and are the reason any giants exist at all in the current day, and because of their limited number, they proceeded to inbreed and became the bumbling fools that we know of to this day as the current giants that happen to wander and grace the presence of several different armies, as well as fallen to chaos themselves. Of course, the tribes, having not been completely satisfied with destroying their enemies and living in their ruined fortresses, began to stir once again. This is mostly due in the part that many small stones were still being rained down from the birth of the Great Maw, and eerie light still pursued the fleeing tribes from their birthplace, and the ogres had to leave yet again. Though it should be noted that ogres have been known to be extremely stubborn, and while they have a great resistance to mutation of chaos, they are not immune. And those ogres that decided to stay in their fortresses through many years, spent in these high, cold, desolate places, were changed by the eerie light and are in fact what we now know today of as the race of Yetis that haunt the coldest and darkest places high in the peaks. The tribes that moved away eventually found their way into the Mountains of Morn, where they bullied and destroyed the nearby competition of Greenskin, Skaven, and even dwarfs for supremacy over the mountain range, both above and below, and established many long-standing camps that are held to this day. Though it should be noted that these places, while held by ogres, are often passed from tribe to tribe due to either infighting or a rival tribe leaving and looking for another place to set down temporary roots and expand their legend and power. Which brings us to the actual development of ogre society and the struggle for power and dominance. The tribe is ruled by what is known as an ogre tyrant or ward leader, and his position in the tribe is decided, like most things in the ogre kingdoms, by the size of his gut, denoting strength, and of course the ability to murder and maim any that oppose him for leadership. Of course, being an extremely violent culture, this is not the only reason blood is shed, as often simply voicing displeasure or not agreeing with the tyrant are warrant enough to lose a limb, which is often eaten by the tyrant. This is, in fact, the reason in the old world you have the phrase, "that will cost you an arm and a leg," as this harsh punishment is not reserved for ogres, but any that may disrespect or offend said tyrant. But I have gotten slightly off topic as we were discussing the hierarchy of the tribes. You have the tyrant, which acts as a chieftain, which is further ruled by an over-tyrant that brings together many tribes, or possibly them all, under his banner. Under the actual tyrants, you have bruisers, and then it is further descends until you have the ogre bulls, tier by tier down the way. Of course, there are many more nuances to the different leadership roles, but those will mostly be covered in the army video. Anyone or thing not an ogre, or not capable of besting an ogre in a guts-out challenge, a vicious duel to the death where the victor literally eats the loser's gut, therefore absorbing his power, is deemed as weak and more than likely possible food, as there are not many rights for those that cannot defend themselves. The everyday life in an ogre tribe is that of violence and constant hunger. Or often when not engaged with the battle or prospect of one soon, and therefore large quantities of fresh meat, brutal games are played between the tribesmen as they drink, eat, and slay one another for sport, and occasionally just for food. One particular game is similar to our concept of sumo, as the ogres remove their clothing, save for their trousers and belt, and both grab a hold of the other's belt and attempt to throw them to the ground in a contest of strength and skill. However, the victor is allowed to then eat a part of the loser, of course, in true ogre fashion. And eating is, in fact, an act of worship in ogre society, with butchers, the cooks of the tribe, acting as priests, and great tables and seating arrayed around a great maw-like pit in the center of the camp, where refuse, rotting meat, and broken weapons and armor are tossed into, as well as several ogre games are actually held. Now, I will be speaking more about the importance of feasts and the nuances involved in a future video, But regardless, feasts are had often, and especially to mark a great victory or a successful hunt. In fact, a tribe's holidays often revolve around victories fought in the past, but this display of revelry is also conducted to flaunt the wealth of a tribe to the other nearby ogre rivals. Similarly, in this vein, ogre tribesmen will often put on displays of strength for no apparent reason, such as throwing boulders, besting monstrous beasts, and climbing cliff faces, all to display the strength of their tribe to rival ogres that might be watching, looking for weakness. As all ogre tribes consider their neighbors as rivals for food and, of course, territory. And while bloodshed between tribes is definitely not unheard of, often resulting in the defeated tribe being absorbed by the victor, there are times that tribes will put aside their differences and join forces, such as if the over-tyrant commands it, or there's an outside threat, like that of the savage men of chaos, that often sweep down out of the waste and into the ogre's territories in the Mountains of Morn. Though they usually do not last long, as the ogres often push back and retrieve any territory they have lost, and the disputes have lasted hundreds, if not thousands, of years between the bordering wastes and that of the Mountains of Morn. And while most ogre tribes are in fact found in the Mountains of Morn, in today's world, ogre tribes are spread out across the entire Warhammer world, as they make excellent mercenaries and have an itch they can't scratch, a need to constantly move, taste more food, to garner more respect, more power. They are often employed by the societies of men, such as the Empire, certainly Talea and Astalia, and of course the Border Princes, and even the distant lands of Araby, Cathay, and Nippon have examples of ogres being used as soldiers and guards, making ogres a very diverse and unique group, as they often attempt to assimilate to the society that they find themselves in, when in the absence of an official large tribe. For instance, in the Empire, it's not uncommon for ogres to attempt to wear clothing and wield weapons they believe are similar to the soldiers that they are employed with. Of course, they are usually a parody of the fashion they are imitating, as most cultures do not have the sheer amount of fabric necessary to cover an ogre's massive bulk. This is especially true of the ogre man-eaters, as they are known, which are the far-traveled veterans that eventually find their way back to a tribe and are recruited for their experience and battle prowess. Despite being labeled as man-eaters, these ogres, like all of their kind, lack the capacity of morality and are employed by all kinds of races, outside of that of even men. The races that have employed ogres, as far as my knowledge is concerned, include dwarves, Skaven, greenskins, and true to their nature, it is not uncommon for ogres to switch sides midway through a battle with the promise of greater wealth or food from the enemy, making them the embodiment of a mercenary company. Because of this fickle nature, most ogre companies are treated with distrust and a healthy dose of respect, as it is not uncommon for them to eat and brutalize their employers if payment is not delivered, or a particularly greedy ogre becomes too hungry and in need of a snack, and an easier way to obtain its wealth is killing his employer rather than actually fighting a pitched battle. However, more times than not, ogres do in fact perform their tasks, and perform them well, as there are very few enemies that can stand the charge of an ogre band. And before we close out this video on the Ogre Kingdoms, we should certainly discuss the methods of reproduction, as it is characteristic of all my societal lore videos. There are, in fact, female ogres, though there is very little information we know about them, or even their place in the hierarchy of the ogres. One can assume they are just as massive as their male counterparts, and probably just as hungry, if not more so, especially when weighted down with child. There appears to be no system of marriage, or at least no mention of it, or possession when it comes to females, and they may simply be in not so good terms, used by all able-bodied men in the tribe to keep their numbers up. Of course, I may be way off base here. There's no way to know. We do not get a vivid description of a single ogre female that I have come across, so if you know of one, please let me know. Now, we do not also get a length of pregnancy time, or even how often they spawn more than one child. Do they often have 6 children at once? Do they have one child? But regardless, this is in fact how the ogres do replenish their numbers, the good old-fashioned way. And of course, we will be touching more on the various beasts and of course noblars the ogres keep around their camps in the following military and army video. The ogre kingdoms on a whole are a tribal society kept in check through might makes right and devotion to the great maw, where a gut means everything and food is the currency, where eating the fallen is custom and blood is shed daily for not much more than amusement. Now, I hope you have learned something new and interesting today, and with that I will be concluding this lore video on the mighty and great ogre kingdoms. There will be more to come, and hopefully not as sporadic as they have been put out recently. Now, I am but a simple man, and it is possible I got something wrong or perhaps missed a concept you would have liked to have seen covered. Now, I will do my best to answer questions down in the comments section and add anything I missed in a future video. The two I have planned are, of course, the Great Maw and the Ogre Military Force, but others may be added depending on interest. Please do make sure to both like this video and subscribe to the channel for future content. It really does help me out, and it does keep the lore flowing. Now, before we go, I would like to say thank you to everyone that has stuck with me up to this point. I know it has been difficult since I became a father, and I appreciate everyone's patience with my content production, and of course all the positive feedback. I would like to say thank you to all of you followers out there, all of you in the cult of thick, as I have dubbed you, and I appreciate you guys greatly. As usual, I have been Jumbo Thick. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Have a good day.